So we will start with the second half of this track, and this is a customer stories track. We have two of the DevOps engineer. One is a lead DevOps engineer, as well as, so both of them are the senior DevOps engineer from Citizens Bank, and they are here with a topic called as a From Swarm to Kubernetes and Back Again. They are here to share their customer experience and stories to find out which orchestration tool to use. And during the course of time, they are going to talk about what operational as well as the development challenges and the problems do you face when they deployed it, right? So please welcome Docker captain and community leader, as well as the DevOps evangelist, Don Bauer, and the lead DevOps engineer, Mike, onto the stage.
Thank you.
Thanks, man.
How's it going, everybody? Oh, you're all tired from lunch. I'm a little disappointed. So what's really funny about this is anytime anyone's asked either one of us, oh, you guys are speaking at DockerCon again this year. What are you talking about? And we're like, oh, well, our talk's from Swarm to Kubernetes and back again. And we get to the from Swarm to Kubernetes part, and half the people we talk to are like, yay! And half the other people are, really? Why? And then we get the opposite reaction for the end back again. So let's talk about that. First thing, introductions, all that. Don Bauer, I'm the lead DevOps engineer for Citizens Bank. And I'm a Docker captain, Docker community leader, and a very happy Docker customer. We've been using Docker in production now for about 3 years, and I've personally been using it for about 5. And then I'll let Mike introduce himself.
And I'm Mike No, one of the senior DevOps engineers at Citizens Bank, and I've been using Docker in production for about 2 years. I'm a long-time system admin who's slowly becoming a developer, so it's fun stuff.
The one thing I do want to throw out there, I had to give this this precursor in Barcelona last year as well. If you're expecting a hyper-technical talk, you're not in the right room. This is a story, but we are happy to follow up with questions and stuff after the talk if you want to get into any of the technical specifics.
It's a bit of a history lesson here. Way back in 2016, I know for you all it's not that far, but we began what we call the Innovation Initiative. And for us, this is the kickstart that we wanted to put our DevOps practices that we were craving really into place. And for us, it all started with containers and Docker, specifically Docker Enterprise. With the Innovation Initiative, we wanted to find a way to use this technology to increase flow through the system, provide constant and accurate feedback to our engineers and the business, and increase our rate of experimentation and learning. Over the next half hour or so, we'll take you on another league of our DevOps journey, and we'll talk about how through standardizing our images and processes for deploying these services, we were able to increase deployments from a few times a quarter to hundreds of times a day across our enterprise. We were able to standardize our integration testing, our reporting, our monitoring, and more, all through Docker Enterprise and a few container smart tools like Instana, GitLab, and LXStack. So I got to the story real quick. So we presented in Barcelona, and like you said, it's called From Swarm to Kubernetes. And we got done with the presentation, we went into another session, and we discovered that Docker was basically fixing all of the things that made us go to Kubernetes. Things like Docker app was coming, which was really big for us. The autopilot patterns that we're going to talk about a little later. But so we got back home and immediately started ripping it all back out. And so then we wrote this presentation, From Swarm to Kubernetes and Back Again.
Yeah. So when we started the Innovation Initiative, and I'm going to go pretty briefly through this because we've already talked on this a number of times. The biggest thing was we needed to change how we built and delivered software within our organization, whether it was something being delivered and built for internal use or customer facing. As a result, our innovation team was founded by our CIO, Sharon Frazier, who actually spoke this morning in the keynote. She's the one that really built the team and continues to run it to this day. This was really the start of our DevOps journey, and what we figured out going into this and going into containers and microservices was we kind of needed to define our culture, define our goals. So this is a slide I shamelessly ripped from my talk last year, but the 4 pillars that we came up with that we take into consideration when we're building anything, whether it's containerized or not, which we'll also touch on in here in a little bit. The 4 pillars are visibility, simplification, standardization, and experimentation. We want all of those things to be constant across our entire platform, no matter who's using it and what they're using it for. We use these pillars to help guide us through any of our architectural decisions, and we take, like Bill in the Phoenix project, for anybody in here who's read that, which I hope is all of you, we tried to take the 3 ways and apply them to every policy and every process that we could across our organization.
So you might ask yourself, why containers? Well, besides the fact that they're the future of pretty much all app dev, as we've seen this morning, one of the things that we chose containers for was configuration management. And you know, effective configuration management is essential to any organization hoping to achieve the kinds of milestones from the likes of Netflix, Lonely Planet, Google, et cetera. With containers, we can review the platform just like we would with code. Containers help us achieve the single piece flow that we're after of our products from development to production. Our system engineers are writing code alongside our software engineers, writing their own branches and merging code like everyone else. Containers with Docker Enterprise gives us increased visibility through the UCP and the container smart tools that connect so well, like Instana. Last but not least, one of our favorite things about containers is our ability to experiment. Containers increase our ability for experimentation without necessarily rocking the boat. And because of the way that we've built our pipelines at Citizens, any of our developers can create personal environments with all of the latest enterprise services with just a few button pushes. This allows our engineers to try things out in production-like ways without risking the business.
So when we first started exploring containers, and we quickly figured out, yes, containers are the way we want to do this. They're the way that allow us to move this forward. It standardizes our packaging format and allows us to build processes that apply to every piece of software that we're deploying, because it always ends with a Docker file that gets turned into a Docker image. After evaluating several solutions when we were first getting started, of course, we had that age-old conversation, do we go with Swarm? Do we go with Kubernetes? There's, of course, other options. You've got Nomad and Marathon, and I'm sure there's plenty more that I'm not thinking about or remembering at the moment. But at the end of the day, we had to choose what best fit our needs. So that came down to, we needed something that was simple to manage, simple to maintain, simple for developers to use, simple for developers to work with. And on the security side, we needed something that allowed us to apply the rules that we're bound to as a financial organization, things like production isolation, node affinity rules, network isolation, microsegmentation, things like that. At the end of the day, Swarm answered all of those needs, and it was also incredibly simple. So that's the reason we went with it. One of the bullet points there is we could support Swarm and Compose with a single file. So we built the Compose files that the developers were using to stand up those services on their local machines. Those same files were used to deploy these services to Swarm, of course with environment variables and parameters and things like that. But we won't dive too much into it. So covering some of the timeline. So November 2016, that's when our innovation team was founded. In February of 2017, we had made the Swarm decision. We stood up our first Docker Enterprise cluster, and we let our development teams under the innovation initiative loose on it. By May of 2017, we had figured out enough and experimented enough that we had a pretty good understanding of what standardizations we need to make. We got our CI/CD processes solidified, and we made it really, really simple to get something from test all the way through to production. In February of 2018, we got to benchmark that process, and Sharon actually mentioned it this morning in the keynote. We had a segment of the business that had a need for a customer-facing application just to get some insight into different things that are in their portfolio. So that application went from a whiteboard drawing to a customer-facing, readily available, deployed, scalable application in less than a week. So that was how we benchmarked. Yes, this process works. Containers work. Swarm was the right case at that point in time. And for us, it still is. But again, we'll get into more of that. And then lastly, April of 2018, we finally went from one cluster and we split all of our production stuff out to another. So one of the reasons we started with Swarm was because we could run prod next to non-prod on the same cluster. But there's definitely reasons you shouldn't do that, no matter what orchestrator you're using. So we went ahead and fixed that in April of 2018. So that was our first big shift in kind of how we were managing everything. The other thing, the numbers in these circles kind of show you at each one of those points in time, each one of those milestones, what our average container count was for right up until the green one for the one cluster, and then we group it all together. So we started, of course, 0 containers. By April of 2018, we were up to roughly 1,000 at any point in time.
So in August 2018, we added the ops cluster. And just like our production cluster, we wanted to segregate some of the things. So our ops cluster runs some of our production supporting applications like delivery, DTR, things like that. By November 18, we had decided that we were going to migrate some of our core data services from Swarm to Kubernetes. And so we executed that plan. Of course, we learned in December that year that we didn't have to do that. We can move it all back. So by January 2019, we had started that process of moving our core data services back to Swarm. One of the other things that happened in January was our CIO issued the statement that all development teams, that all new work must utilize containers.
Container first.
Container first. And so that was something that Don and I had been pushing for a while, was we really wanted the work to be done in containers on the new platform so we could do it the right DevOps way. In February 2018, we onboarded 2 non-innovation teams. And we got them started in the process of Docker and GitLab and our process for the pipelines and how to do on that. And by April of 2019, we had our first full app deployment. It took about 6 weeks to go from whiteboard to full prod, but we were also integrating with another vendor, so it took some work back and forth to get that there. But still, I thought 6 weeks was pretty good.
So, February to April, February is when we onboarded those new teams. April was when they released their first customer-facing production application. Most of them had no experience with Docker, no experience with containers. They were just going with the processes we've set up, the documentation that we were able to provide, as well as, Docker's official training, which hopefully some of you have been through. Play with Docker, play with Kubernetes. Those were both very big proponents in our training. So I wanted to call that out specifically because a lot of these, when you look at, February to April, getting an app into production, that might not sound, you might be thinking, well, okay, that's all right. But these were 2 teams who've only been working on legacy for as long as they've been with the company, which in some cases was coming up on a decade. They were able to get an app built up of almost a dozen services from ideation into production in 2 months. So wanted to call that out. But more specifically, I want to talk about how we got here and the decisions that we made along the way. So you rewind a little bit back to November of last year. That's when we decided to move some of our services over to Kubernetes. So, show of hands, how many people in here are currently using Kubernetes today? All right, how many of you are using Kubernetes in production today? So, my question, I'm very impressed, by the way, that's awesome. My question is, why do you use Kubernetes? I'll let the slide sink in for just a sec. All right. So we run a bunch of meetups and various developer events in Nashville, and we get approached by lots of people all the time saying, hey, why do you use Swarm? And we'll walk through it and we'll end that conversation. Well, why do you guys use Kubernetes? This is the most prominent answer right here. Because my boss told me to. And if you learn anything from this talk or the one that we gave in Barcelona, at the end of the day, that's not a good reason to choose anything. If your boss told you to use Swarm and that's the only reason you're using it, then you might need to question it. We want you to pick the best solution. But for us, why we use KA, it's all hand off to Mike.
I think it's pretty easy to see why we considered Kubernetes. Firstly, one of our favorite things about Kubernetes is Helm. It's whether you're packaging services up to be used by Helm or using Helm to deploy them, it's easily one of my favorite tools. Are you guys, the folks that are using Kubernetes in production, are you using Helm to deploy stuff to production? Yes, sort of, maybe. Okay, cool. Yeah, that was sort of our modus operandi. We really wanted to be able to use the default tools like that. The operator patterns really were an impressive bit of code for me that at least proves once again that anything humans can do, computers can do better. And I really feel like they should. I don't like getting up at 2 in the morning to go restart services if I don't have to. And so one of our things for moving the core data services for Kubernetes was to be able to use some of these things for the stateful services that we wanted to scale automatically for like Kafka, Zookeeper, that sort of stuff. We love the amount of community support that we get for whether it's the Kubernetes stuff that we're doing or the Docker stuff that we're doing. The folks like you guys in this room right now are what makes this so much fun for us. And while we get so much done, I really feel like. And so, now with, I think it was with 2.0, Kubernetes shipped with Docker Enterprise. And so for us, that allowed us to fuel our need for experimentation without having to go back out and relearn how to stand up new clusters or anything like that. We could actually just use the built-in Kubernetes cluster within Docker Enterprise. In some other cases, we had some vendors that we had dealt with or who we had partnered with for one reason or another who just would not support our Swarm installation. They would only support the Kubernetes orchestrator. And so that was part of the reason we wanted to try to move some of these over there to get some of that extra support that we were paying for but not necessarily getting yet.
So yeah, there we go. As it turns out, you can push back on vendors when you need them to support something else. That was a hard lesson for us to learn. But what we quickly discovered after we migrated some of our core data services to Kubernetes, there's a lot of things that were very different. And the first thing was our cluster footprint had to change. I already mentioned some of the reasons that we chose Swarm initially for network segregation, things like that, being able to run multiple sandboxes in the same cluster while being guaranteed that they were running on completely separate networks. We could isolate specific services to specific nodes, things like that. What we figured out is, well, if we start moving everything over to Kubernetes, we are going to have to stand up one cluster for each environment. And I know you can get around some of that with namespaces and some of that by tainting nodes. I'm pretty sure given enough time, we probably could have solved all of those goals. But right now, we're just identifying why it was hard. The other thing, so I'm going to cover security and complexity in the next couple of slides, but the other big thing was training. What happened, and it was something that we kind of forgot when we were making this change. Like we knew, me and Mike and my team, we knew why we wanted to move those services over to Kubernetes. We knew what was driving that. So we put that together, we did it. And then after we moved them, we realized, oh, none of our developers know how to work with Kubernetes. None of our operations engineers know how to support it. So we pretty quickly discovered that after we moved those services, no one could easily debug them. Nobody could easily diagnose anything or otherwise work with those services, at least at the orchestrator level. UCP, of course, got around some of that complexity. One of Docker Enterprise's offerings for managing the cluster. But when it came down to the stuff that was actually making, the reasons that we have those people in those positions, it was making it really hard for them to do their jobs. And that kind of fell back on us, and we've since learned from that. I don't want anybody here to make that same mistake, because that was hard.
So in accordance with the first way, we wanted to reduce our work in process as much as possible. And Swarm with Docker Enterprise helps us keep our infrastructure, our implementations, and our integrations simpler, which means less work, fewer issues getting our applications to production. Docker Enterprise mitigates some of the complexity of Kubernetes by plugging in the tools that we already love with the APIs we love to hate. And in the end, I just felt like we were really getting too far from that simple mentality of the pillars and how we build and make decisions.
So the other thing, again, going back to the security side, one of the biggest issues we ran into was we had nodes that were very specific to very specific environments for one reason or another. We couldn't find an easy way to grant access to just those nodes to different engineers and security personnel when we were running those services in Kubernetes. The other big thing was, taints versus collections. They both kind of solve the same need, but in our experience, collections were a lot easier to work with. They made more sense for us, and like we're going to touch on, not every solution's right for everybody, but this is why we kind of veered away on the security side.
Not to mention Docker context now.
Yes. The other thing, this is probably my favorite slide in the presentation. So this is an exact YAML from our monitoring vendor. They're one of our favorite vendors that we use, which is Instana. And actually, Kevin Crawley, another Docker captain, is here giving a workshop on monitoring and visibility. So if you have a chance to catch that, definitely do. But what we figured out was, if we want to deploy this service to Swarm, it's a little tiny 5-line YAML. If we want to deploy the same service using the vendor's documentation to Swarm, we've got a 120-something line YAML. And yeah, I know a lot of it's comments. I understand that. But the 5 lines to this, we very quickly discovered that was going to be hard to manage and maintain across multiple projects and using our microservices. And each microservice gets its own repo, has its own everything. So we had to very quickly figure out how we were going to manage the plethora of YAML files across all those repositories. And it's one of the things that led us away. So after DockerCon Barcelona, we made another decision that was another very, I don't want to say it was hard to make, but it wasn't met well, since we just went through all that effort of moving stuff to Kubernetes. So if it's not already obvious, let's talk about why we went back to Swarm. Despite our best efforts, what we figured out was either solution came with some amount of overhead and problem solving needed. So whether we ran our stuff on Swarm or Kubernetes, there were different things that we were going to have to figure out.
And rebuilding everything in Kubernetes just really wasn't what we wanted to do. It wasn't even an option for us. We like Swarm. We like working with Swarm. We wanted that to be the default mode that we were used. So we definitely didn't want to just go through the process of putting everything on Kubernetes.
At the end of the day, we still had a small team. We still required that simple to manage solution, both for the operations side and the developers. The other biggest thing, and we were really, really excited about this when we presented in Barcelona, was application packaging. We looked to Helm for that, thinking we were going to be moving everything to Kubernetes. At Barcelona, Docker App got announced, and the day it got announced, I think our talk was the next day, both him and I pulled up and we were like, well, that was like 90% of why we moved. So Docker App solves the application packaging problem for us.
So philosophy is something that Don and I talk about a lot, and something we've mentioned a few times already here today, but especially when it comes to how we manage our systems and flow through the system. And we're big fans of the Phoenix Project, which you mentioned, and also The Goal by Eliyahu Goldratt. Those are 2 books that we strongly recommend to every single person who's ever touched a computer. And so, and I say all that to say that Swarm and Kubernetes were built with two different philosophies in mind. Swarm aims to offer high-impact solutions while prioritizing simplicity. Kubernetes aims to offer a solution for literally every conceivable problem. And so the part comes into how much control and convenience you want. You want total control of everything? Kubernetes is probably what you look for. Simplicity and convenience, Docker Swarm.
Yeah, the philosophy was one of the biggest things that made us move back to Swarm was, we figured out looking at both solutions, they were both great solutions. They're both great orchestrators. They both solve very, very similar problems. But like Mike just said, they were both built with very different philosophies. And so we had to, at the end of the day, choose the one that most matched our philosophies with our culture and our processes. And that's what led us back to Swarm. In having these conversations leading up to this conference, leading up to today and right now, we've had several talks with engineers that have been facing maybe similar problems, maybe not, but what we've discovered along the path, there's a lot of problems, a lot of things that drive people to use or choose one orchestrator or another. And as it turns out, there's actually solutions for most of those problems on both sides. And I mean, these come down to things like auto-scaling, network segmentation, user access, zero downtime deployments, monitoring, alerting, reporting, instrumentation. Those are all problems that got to be solved one way or the other. And as it turns out, there is solutions for most of those on both sides, whether you're using Swarm or Kubernetes.
And for anyone who's deployed a stateful service, like whether it's a database or a messaging cluster, those kinds of deployments can be tricky in containers. Stateful services are difficult. Whether it's the volumes, the configs, the variables, it's all more complicated when it's stateful. Kafka, for example, is a messaging queue that runs in clusters. Each node needs to be, if you're going to scale it dynamically and run it in containers, each node needs to be configured dynamically. And auto-scaling can be really nearly impossible with something like that, since each node in a cluster has to be configured and know about every other node in the cluster as it's being built up. So one of the things that helps us with that is now the operator patterns and the autopilot patterns. The way these sort of work, and we'll talk a little bit about what they do later, but allow us to observe, analyze, and act on the services in a meaningful, codified way. And so, according to autopilot.io, autopilot pattern applications.
These definitions are shamelessly ripped directly from their websites. So there's no paraphrasing.
Not at all. We try to live by these definitions when we're building anything. There's a lot of really smart expert people out there, and we try to listen to them. So. And then, of course, for the operator patterns, this is how they define it from CoreOS. And basically, the only difference is one is Kubernetes and one is Swarm.
So the other big thing that I've mentioned a couple times was application packaging. Deploying applications that are made up of, tens and hopefully not hundreds, but I mean in the ecosystem maybe, but dozens of microservices, that can be really difficult to manage, especially when you're talking about versions across different microservices not lining up with maybe the application version. That was one of the biggest problems we were initially setting out to solve as well. At the end of the day, we figured out, well, Docker app solves that problem as well. You can also use Docker app to deploy Helm packages and deploy things to Kubernetes, so double win. But this right here was the problem we were trying to solve. This is just an example made up service, but between upgrading that service or that application rather from like version 2.0 to 2.1, you might have these 6 services that are changing versions, and you've got 3 additional components you're adding. Managing each one of those individually at the very beginning sounded great, but in practice it actually turns out it's really hard. This slide is also shamelessly ripped from a presentation I'll be doing tomorrow at 2 o'clock with Chris from Docker, where we are going in depth on Docker app and CNAB and kind of how it might help in these kind of situations. So I'll leave that alone for now. And if you want to hear more, you know where to find us at 2 o'clock tomorrow.
Whether you're deploying Kubernetes clusters or the Docker enterprise clusters, it's not usually fun, especially building this stuff from scratch. But thankfully, today we don't have to do that. There's a lot of tools out there, and one of the tools that we use for all of our clusters is the Docker certified infrastructure templates. And with these, we can build our clusters, whether it's our ops, production, or test, in 30 minutes or less. And our clusters vary anywhere from, I think we have 15 nodes all the way up to 29, 30?
40.
40. So this is the, I guess that's it.
So there's a lot more things that I mentioned when it comes to orchestrator agnostic solutions. We couldn't dive into every one of them, and honestly, for some of them, I've got answers, but they're bookmarks in my Google history or my Chrome browser. But you know, those last three were the specific ones. The thing that really drove us throughout most of this process, and we did lose sight of it for a little bit, was kind of the human factor. Whether it was us implementing Docker, us implementing Swarm, us implementing Kubernetes, the hardest part of every one of those things, every one of those initiatives, was everybody else. It wasn't the technology, it wasn't the platform we chose. It was getting, you know, the people trained, getting the visibility out there, getting people up to speed, and that's one of the things we've been really happy about. And you know, with Docker Enterprise, with Kubernetes, with everything that we're using, we still want to enable the choice. We're not telling developers, no, you can't use Kubernetes. But now that most of them have had exposure to both sides, they're choosing to use Swarm for the same reasons we are, because again, that ties right back in with our philosophies of keeping things simple and easy. The other big thing was change management. I have never seen a release manager so excited than the first time he saw how he handled one of our Docker deployments, because he used to have to do all sorts of stuff manually, get this email, run this SQL file, put this jar file in this one very specific spot, press a button at a very specific time, and then just cross his fingers and hope everything worked. Then we were like, well, this app's Docker. You want to deploy it, press that button. and that was it. And he was blown away. You know, so those level of changes and things, you know, we've really benefited from, and we don't want to throw all that away. So we emphasize this in Barcelona. At the end of the day, we want to offer that choice, make it available. But for us, in most cases, Swarm fits our philosophy, and that's why we choose to use it. It's not going to have an answer for everything. Kubernetes, despite their best efforts, isn't going to have an answer for everything either, at least not until next version. Did you want to elaborate on any of that?
I think you got it all.
I kind of cut into yours. I'm
That's
sorry.
Okay. We're running low on time anyway, so.
So we've done a lot of shameless things this talk. I'm also going to shamelessly tell you that we at Citizens are hiring. We're always looking for technologists, evangelists, you know, people like you that are excited about things like DockerCon, excited about containers, excited about changing the world one way or the other. So if you're looking or thinking about looking, hit us up. And with that, we will open it up for questions.
We have 7 minutes. That's fast.
Yeah.
Did you do Kubernetes on your own or with a vendor?
So we did Kubernetes through the Docker Enterprise offering with Docker Enterprise 2.0. When that first released, it came with Kubernetes bundled in as well. So we weren't going through any other vendor or any other you know, solutions that way.
Yeah. Any questions?
No one? Oh, what about anybody? 1 second. Okay.
Yeah, he's got a mic coming.
Is most of your infrastructure in-house or in the cloud?
It's all on-prem.
Yeah,
It's all on-prem.
Great question. We didn't cover that at all.
No, we didn't.
Yeah, 100% of it's on-prem. We do utilize the cloud for offsite backups and things like that. And this year we will be moving to a hybrid solution where we've got some stuff on-prem, some stuff in the cloud. But right now, everything that's actively running customer-facing on-prem.
In the back here. Going forward, what do you think you see Swarm needing to keep you on it?
Well,
Versus
so
what Kubernetes did?
there's some really exciting things that are happening with it, and they'll be discussing some of that in the Open Source Summit. So, I mean, you look at things like in the keynote this morning when they were talking about Visa. You know, they did all of that on Swarm, and you know, there's lots of other companies that can boast similar things about Kubernetes. At the end of the day, like I said, it kind of comes down to your philosophy and your choice. But I do still see it being an actively used, actively adopted orchestrator, especially, you know, like I emphasized with the philosophy of our organization. We haven't seen anything else that fits that philosophy as well. And there is you know, new stuff, new features coming, especially with 1903 and some of the other stuff. Like I said, they'll be talking about in the Open Source Summit.
I'm curious about your teams. You had talked about an ops team, you talked about the developers, and you have your team. Did you have an infrastructure team to begin with? When the new innovation team was stood up, did you bring your own infrastructure and that you managed top to bottom, or what did that look like?
We basically manage all of the Docker, the new innovation infrastructure ourselves. All of the stuff that's in VMware. We have storage folks and infrastructure folks that we lean on for things like if we need an F5 configuration for the front end business stuff, something like that. But for the most part, it's all managed by us. Our team is 4 strong at the moment.
Yep.
So,
yeah, the operations team, in our case, is synonymous with the infrastructure team. They handle all the networking, all the storage, all of the physical and virtual infrastructure. You know, comes to VMs, comes to the actual physical servers and the colos, things like that.
Hi. I just wanted to ask a question about kind of philosophical question. You like philosophy. You talked about the 3 ways, and one of the things in the 3 ways is enabling choice. Mm-hmm. How do you manage the balance between enabling choice and doing releases? Because that's something that I've come across, that Helm is not the only option.
mm-hmm. Right.
And
Right.
if you enable choice, you end up with
So,
3 engineers with 3 different, very strongly nerd rage held opinions.
right.
So how do you manage that?
So one of the things that we try to do is we try to do everything one at a time. You know, the single piece flow doesn't apply to just how you push containers or services to production, but and also how you manage your projects, right? So if we want to enable developers to have more choice in those things, we'll build one pipeline and we'll get that as close to perfect as we can, and then we'll start building a second one with more options or more tools or different tools. But we want to know that that first one is stable before we start on the second one. And then we try to offer as much as we can. I mean, our developers, we have .NET, we have Java, we have Spring Boot. I mean, we have a wide range of
All the things.
Python.
All the
all the things. So. And we're trying to enable our developers to be more open to different tools, and because we want to have the best tool for the job, not necessarily just one tool for every job.
Yeah. We do have a subset of nodes in each cluster that does run only the Kubernetes orchestrator, so we've enabled everybody to try it out, to do their testing, do their things like that, you know, work with it, decide if it's the best solution, because at the end of the day, we want to enable that experimentation. At the end of that experiment, if they decide, yeah, we want to move forward with this, that's kind of where our team steps in, and then we'll help them put some standards and processes around it and make everything as simple as it can be to get that pipeline all the way through to release. So it's more of a people problem than anything else, and it's just, you know, our process, our standards, how we've kind of built everything with that innovation initiative and everything since then. Did that answer your question? I'm seeing nods, so.
Somebody?
How do you handle persistent storage?
Persistent storage. So in our case, on-prem, we work with 2 different storage vendors. We have one for block level storage, one for file storage, like NFS. So we use NetApp for all the NFS stuff using the Trident plugins, and then we use Pure Storage with one of their NVMe storage appliances for all of our block level storage. And then we've got mirrors of that in our other data centers for DR and all. But yeah, that's one thing where we got really lucky because both of those vendors have all that figured out.
Go ahead. We're almost out of time.
Okay, so I'll try to make it quick. So I think this dichotomy of Swarm is simple and Kubernetes is complicated is a little bit more complicated than that because
It is.
I feel like Kubernetes allows the developers to stack together simpler containers, whereas Swarm, simpler single concern containers into a pod that is then the unit of replication, right? And so I feel like Swarm, if you take logging sidecar pattern as an example, Swarm makes that enormously more complicated. I wonder if I'm wrong about that or if you have a different perspective.
So, I mean, there's definitely things on the Swarm side that are going to be more complicated because Swarm itself doesn't have an answer to every problem. You know, one of the slides, we had a bullet point up there that kind of said, you got to choose what challenge you want to tackle. So, you know, there's lots of things that answer is moving to the other side, but then we have to tackle the complexity of, you know, managing all those YAML files, getting everybody up to speed on it.
I would love to talk to you more and see what your challenges are.
Yeah, I definitely want to follow up on that. I do know we are out of time.
Yeah, we are.
But
All right.
yeah, no, let's definitely follow up. We'll both be available after the session.
Yeah.
If anybody wanted to catch up. You know, thank you for coming. Thank you for your time.
Welcome to
thank you all.
DockerCon. If it's the first time.
So
Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll have a next session at 3, and it is on Docker on Windows.